Why do humans often reject direct truth but accept the same truth when it arrives disguised? It's a strange question because most of us assume that if something is true, the most effective way to communicate it would simply to say it directly. State the truth, present the facts, explain the conclusion. And yet, throughout human history, some of the most influential ideas rarely arrived that way. Instead, they arrived through stories, through myths, through parables, through jokes, through symbols, through riddles, through dreams, through metaphors. And what's interesting is that humans seem to return to these forms again and again. Not just one culture, not just one religion, not just in one period of history, almost everywhere. Which raises an interesting question. Why? Why would people repeatedly choose indirect communication when direct communication seems simpler? Because if the goal is understanding, wouldn't it be easier to simply explain the truth? And yet, many of the ideas people remember most deeply were never presented as instructions. They were presented as stories, a fable, a myth, a lesson hidden inside a narrative, a joke that revealed something unexpected, a symbol that stayed with someone long after the explanation had been forgotten. And maybe you've experienced this yourself. Sometimes someone gives advice and it disappears almost immediately. But a story stays. A scene from a movie stays. A dream stays. A metaphor stays. A conversation stays. Something about it continues unfolding long after the moment itself has passed. You're listening to The Occult and the Apocalypse, where we explore the hidden and the revealed through patterns, symbolism, and awareness. Not to predict, but to notice, and not to conclude, but to understand. And maybe that's because humans do not only learn through information. Humans also learn through discovery. There's a difference between being told something and realizing something. A difference between receiving an answer and uncovering an answer. And perhaps that difference is part of why truth so often arrives wearing a disguise. Because sometimes the longest path to understanding turns out to be the shortest path to awareness. And maybe that's where the trickster becomes interesting again. Because in our last episode, we explored the trickster as a figure of disruption. A figure who exposed contradictions, revealed blind spots, and challenged certainty. But what if disruption is only part of the story? What if the trickster isn't just disrupting reality? What if the trickster is helping truth travel in a form people are actually willing to receive? Because once you start looking across history, mythology, religion, psychology, and storytelling, a strange pattern begins to emerge. Again and again, truth seems to arrive disguised as something else. And once you begin noticing that pattern, it's difficult not to see it everywhere. Because throughout history, many of the most enduring forms of wisdom were rarely delivered as direct instruction. They arrived wrapped in something else. A story, a symbol, a joke, a paradox, a riddle, a narrative. Something that invited participation instead of demanding agreement. And what's fascinating is how often completely different cultures arrived at similar approaches. Religious traditions used parables. Philosophers used thought experiments. Teachers used fables. Mystics used symbols. Storytellers used myths. Again and again, people seem to discover that truth often traveled further when it arrived indirectly. Take parables, for example. A parable doesn't usually begin by telling people what to think. Instead, it presents a situation, a character, a dilemma, a choice. And then it allows the listener to participate in discovering the meaning. The lesson isn't simply delivered, it's encountered. And perhaps that's part of why parables have remained memorable for thousands of years. The story creates space for reflection. The listener becomes involved in the process. The truth is not merely received, it's discovered. Similar patterns appear in many wisdom traditions. Zen teachers often use paradoxical statements called koans, questions that seem impossible to answer logically. Not necessarily because the question itself was the point, but because wrestling with the question changed the way people approached understanding. The answer mattered, but so did the process of arriving there. Even ancient myths often function this way. People sometimes treat myths as primitive attempts at explaining reality, but many myths seem less interested in providing information than providing insight. They communicate through images, stories, characters, symbols. The lesson arrives indirectly, not because the lesson is weak, but because some forms of understanding seem difficult to communicate through facts alone. And maybe that's why even philosophers occasionally behaved like tricksters. Diogenes is a fascinating example. Rather than simply arguing against social conventions, he often challenged them through absurd actions, humor, and public demonstrations. According to the stories told about him, he once walked through the streets carrying a lamp in broad daylight, claiming he was in search for an honest person. Whether every story about Diogenes is historically accurate or not, the point remains interesting. He didn't merely explain his criticism, he embodied it. The lesson became visible. Again, truth arrived disguised as something else. A story, a performance, a paradox, a disruption. And the more examples you encounter, the more a strange pattern begins to emerge. Humanity repeatedly discovered that direct information and meaningful understanding are not always the same thing. People can hear information without changing. People can memorize facts without understanding. People can repeat ideas without integrating them. But a story, a symbol, a paradox, a moment of recognition, those sometimes linger. Those sometimes continue unfolding long after the conversation ends, which raises another interesting possibility. Maybe disguised truth isn't a workaround. Maybe it's one of the oldest teaching technologies humans have ever developed. And Maybe this is where the question becomes even more interesting. Because if humans have been using stories, symbols, parables, myths, jokes, and riddles to communicate truth for thousands of years, then we have to ask another question. Why does it work? What is happening inside the human mind that makes indirect truth so effective? And while there isn't just one simple answer, psychology offers some interesting clues. Because humans are not purely rational creatures receiving information objectively. We interpret, we defend, we filter. We compare new information against existing beliefs, experiences, identities, and assumptions. And sometimes when people feel directly challenged, something interesting happens. Defenses activate, not necessarily because the information is false, sometimes because the information feels threatening to identity, to certainty, to belonging, to the story someone has been telling themselves about who they are and how the world works. And once those defenses activate, understanding can become surprisingly difficult. The conversation shifts, people stop exploring, and start protecting, which may be part of why stories often work differently. A story doesn't usually begin by saying, "You're wrong." A story says, "Let me show you something." A parable says, "Consider this." A myth says, "What do you see here?" A symbol asks for interpretation. A riddle invites participation. The listener becomes involved in the process. And maybe that's important. Because there's a difference between receiving information and discovering meaning. A difference between being told the answer and arriving at the answer. When people discover something for themselves, they often experience it differently. The insight feels personal, participatory, earned, not imposed. And that doesn't mean every self-discovered insight is automatically correct. People can misunderstand stories just as easily as they can misunderstand facts. But the process itself is interesting because discovery creates engagement. People lean in. They become curious. They start asking questions. And questions often remain open longer than conclusions do, which may explain why so many wisdom traditions repeatedly rely on questions rather than declarations. Why so many teachers tell stories instead of lectures. Why so many myths communicate through symbols rather than instructions. And perhaps that's part of what the trickster is doing as well. The trickster rarely hands people answers. The trickster creates conditions where answers become difficult to avoid. A contradiction becomes visible. A blind spot appears. A certainty begins to wobble. And suddenly someone sees something they hadn't seen before. Not because they were forced to, but because they discovered it. And maybe that's the deeper pattern connecting stories, symbols, parables, myths, and tricksters alike. They don't simply transfer information, they create participation. And sometimes participation changes people in ways information alone cannot. And maybe that's why truth seems remarkably flexible. Not because truth itself changes, but because the forms that carry it do. Throughout history, Truth has worn many different costumes. Sometimes it arrives as a story, sometimes as a symbol. Sometimes it's a dream, sometimes as humor, sometimes in art, sometimes as a myth, sometimes as a question. And what's fascinating is these forms often look very different on the surface. A dream is not a joke, a symbol is not a parable, a myth is not a painting, and a riddle is not a conversation. And yet they often seem to be doing something surprisingly similar. They create space where meaning can be discovered rather than delivered. Take symbols, for example. A symbol rarely arrives with a single fixed interpretation attached to it. Instead, symbols invite participation. People reflect on them, they project meaning onto them, and discover connections through them. The symbol becomes a meeting place between the external image and the internal experience of the person encountering it. Stories often work similarly. Two people can hear the same story and walk away focusing on completely different lessons. Not because the story failed, but because stories allow people to encounter meaning from where they currently are. Dreams can function this way as well. People have spent thousands of years trying to understand dreams, not simply because dreams provide answers, but because dreams often communicate through images, emotions, associations, and symbols rather than direct explanations. Again, meaning arrives indirectly. And even humor follows a surprisingly similar pattern. A joke often works because it suddenly reveals a connection that wasn't obvious before. A contradiction, an assumption, an unexpected perspective. People laugh because something hidden becomes visible, which sounds remarkably similar to what we've been discussing through this entire series. The disguise changes. The process remains familiar. Something concealed becomes revealed. Something unnoticed becomes visible. Something assumed becomes questioned. And maybe that's why these forms continue appearing throughout human history. Because humans do not only seek information, humans seek meaning. And meaning often emerges through participation, through reflection, through discovery, and through relationship, which suggests something interesting. Perhaps stories, symbols, dreams, humors, myths, and even tricksters are not competing ways of communicating truth. Perhaps they are different languages attempting to communicate the same kinds of insight. Different costumes, different masks, different doorways, leading toward understanding. And maybe the most surprising part of all of this is that we never really stopped doing it. It's tempting to think of disguised truth as something ancient, something associated with myths, parables, sacred stories, old wisdom traditions. But when you look closely, the same pattern seems to be everywhere. Even now, a meme can sometimes communicate an idea more effectively than a lengthy explanation. A joke can expose a contradiction in seconds. A satirical article can reveal something people have been sensing for years without fully articulating. A scene from a film can stay with somebody long after they've forgotten the plot. A novel can change the way someone sees the world without ever presenting itself as an argument. Again and again, truth continues arriving in forms that don't immediately announce themselves as truth. Which is interesting because modern culture often prides itself on information. We have access to more information than perhaps any generation in human history. Facts are everywhere. Explanations are everywhere. Opinions are everywhere. And yet stories remain powerful. Symbols remain powerful. Humor remains powerful. Why? Because information and meaning are not always the same thing. A person can possess information without feeling connected to it. A person can understand a fact without understanding themselves. A person can know something intellectually without integrating it into their experience. And perhaps that's why stories continue to matter, why films continue to matter, why art continues to matter, why humor continues to matter. Not because they replace truth, but because they help people encounter truth differently. Sometimes a joke reveals what an argument cannot. Sometimes a story reaches what a lecture could not. Sometimes a symbol communicates what a definition cannot. And perhaps that's why disguised truth continues appearing in every era. The costume changes, the technology changes, the medium changes, but the underlying process remains remarkably familiar. People discover something, recognize something, see something differently. And once they've seen it, it's often difficult to completely unsee it, which is interesting because that's exactly the pattern we've been tracing throughout the entire episode. Not the transmission of information, but the creation of recognition. The moment where something hidden becomes revealed. The moment when an assumption becomes conscious. The moment when a person realizes they already knew something but hadn't fully seen it yet. And maybe that's why disguised truth continues working. Not because it tricks people, but because it invites people to participate in their own understanding. And maybe that's where one final question becomes important. Because if truth can arrive disguised, then so can everything else. Stories can communicate wisdom, but stories can also persuade. Symbols can reveal meaning, but symbols can also be projected onto. Humor can expose blind spots, but humor can also distract from them. The same mechanisms that help people discover insight can sometimes be used to shape perception in less helpful ways. Which means disguised truth is not automatically true simply because it's disguised. And maybe that's where discernment is important. Because the goal is not to believe every story. The goal is not to assume every symbol contains a hidden message. And the goal is not to treat every coincidence as revelation. The goal is awareness. Curiosity balanced with reflection. Openness balanced with discernment. A willingness to explore without surrendering the ability to question. Because stories can illuminate, but they can also mislead. Symbols can reveal, but they can also obscure. A powerful narrative can help someone understand themselves more deeply, and a powerful narrative can also convince someone of something that isn't true. The form alone cannot tell us whether something contains wisdom. We have to engage with it, reflect on it, question it, test it against experience. And maybe that's why so many wisdom traditions place such importance on discernment. Not because stories are dangerous and not because symbols are unreliable, but because meaning is participatory. The listener still matters. The observer still matters. The person interpreting the story still matters. And perhaps that's the final balance hidden inside all of this. Neither blind acceptance nor automatic dismissal, but thoughtful engagement. The willingness to ask, what is this showing me? What is this inviting me to consider? And does it help me see more clearly? Because perhaps clarity is ultimately the difference between insight and manipulation. One expands awareness, the other attempts to replace it. So why do humans often reject direct truth but accept the same truth when it arrives disguised? Perhaps because understanding is not always the same thing as information. Information can be delivered, understanding has to be discovered. And throughout this episode, we've seen that pattern appear again and again in stories, in myths, in parables, in symbols, in dreams, in humor, in art. Across cultures, traditions, and periods of history, people repeatedly develop ways of communicating that invited participation rather than demanding agreement. Not because truth was being hidden, but because some forms of truth seem easier to encounter than to explain. A story creates space for reflection. A symbol creates space for interpretation. A question creates space for discovery. And sometimes those spaces allow people to recognize something that they may have otherwise resisted. Not because they've been persuaded, but because they've participated. Because they've seen something for themselves. And maybe that's why truth so often arrives wearing a disguise. Not to conceal itself, but to make itself easier to receive. Not to bypass awareness, but to invite awareness. Not to replace understanding, but to create the conditions where understanding can emerge. And perhaps that's the deeper pattern connecting all the forms we've explored throughout the episode. The story, the symbol, the dream, the myth, the joke, the trickster. Different forms, different languages, different disguises, but often serving a remarkably similar purpose. Helping people discover what they may not have been ready to hear directly. Which is interesting, because once we begin looking at the trickster this way, another question starts to emerge. Not why the trickster reveals truth, but why the trickster so often appears at moments of change. Because throughout myths, stories, and human experience, trickster figures seem to appear most often when old structures are becoming unstable and new structures have not yet fully formed. At thresholds, at turning points, at transitions. And maybe that's not a coincidence, because next week we'll explore the final piece of the trickster arc. Not disruption, not revelation, but transformation. Why do trickster figures so often appear right before something new begins? Thank you for being here with me and helping me take the occult and the apocalypse and see it as just the hidden and the revealed. Come back next week. I'll see you there.